Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in just a few moments, but before we do, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with those of you that have joined us in the room. For those of you that we do have in the room, the first thing I would like to make mention of is our chat pod, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen marked chat. This chat pod is the best way to communicate with us. If you have any questions regarding today's material, all questions pertaining to the material will be retained until the Q&A session that will be held at the very end of today's webinar. So please feel free at any point of today's talk to go ahead and type in your questions there in the chat pod, and we will pull them out and house them in our Q&A cache to be answered during our Q&A session at the very end. This chat pod is also the best way to communicate with us should you experience any technical issues. If you do have any technical issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat, and either myself or one of our customer service representatives will make sure to get you taken care of. All of your audio for today's webinar is going to be streaming through your computer speakers, so if at any point of today's webinar you have any audio issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat, and we will be sure to get you taken care of. We are utilizing our new platform as we have been for all of the month of May. So just a few things that will make sure that you are experiencing the best quality webinar possible. We have found that Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox are going to be the best web browsers to watch today's event on. So do make sure that you are utilizing one of those web browsers if possible. Also make sure to hit the play button in the middle of the live feed area. That way you can start your feed of the live event. Also, if for any reason you lose audio or your video stops playing of the live feed, just refresh your screen and hit the play button again, and that should start your feed. We do have about 4 or 5 minutes before we get started. So before we do, I would like to find out a little bit more about our audience and where you're joining us from, as well just to make sure that the chat pod is working for you. So if you could please take a few moments just to I apologize, just to type in your location there in the chat pod, and that'll give us some great information and feedback about our audience and where everyone is joining us from today. We do have a few minutes before we get started, so I'm going to mute my line back, and I'll come back on and go through housekeeping once more, and then we will get started at the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in just about 2 minutes, but before we do, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with those of you that have come into the room. The first thing I would like to make mention for our audience members is the chat pod, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen marked chat. This chat pod is going to be the best way to communicate with us if you have any questions regarding today's material. All questions pertaining to the material will be retained until the Q&A session that will be held at the very end of today's webinar. And so please feel free at any point of today's talk and PowerPoint to go ahead and type in your question there in the chat pod, and we'll pull that out and house that for you, and then we will get that answered today after the presentation is complete. This chat pod is also the best way to communicate with us should you experience any technical issues. If you do have any technical issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat, and we will be sure to get you taken care of. I apologize for that. We've taken care of that echo. We've got just about a minute left, so before we do get started, we have found out a few things about our new platform that could be beneficial and make sure that you are experiencing the best possible webinar through our platform today. We have found that Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox are going to give the audience the best experience possible, so please make sure you are utilizing one of those web browsers if possible. Also, there is a live feed of today's event there in the middle of your screen. Make sure you do hit the play button to start that live feed. And if for any reason your live feed does stop, just refresh the page and hit the live feed again, and that should refresh and start your page over. Sometimes the start button is on the bottom right-hand corner, depending of the live feed, depending on what kind of web browser you are using. It is the top of the hour, so I'm going to mute my line back, shift to some things around momentarily, and then we will get started here shortly. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers with RTI International's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, and I will be your host and moderator for today's event. Today's webinar is entitled Growing the Forensic Nursing Specialty. We do have two presenters and subject matter experts for today's webinar. Our first presenter is Dr. Pat Speck. She graduated from the University of Tennessee Health Science Center College of Nursing in 1982. With her bachelor's and then her master's in 1985 and her doctorate in 2005. After retiring from UTHSC College of Nursing as the DMP Public Health Nursing and DMP Forensic Nursing Concentration Coordinator, she joined the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Nursing in the Department of Community Health, Outcomes, and Systems. Currently, Dr. Speck is a professor and coordinator of the Graduate Advanced Forensic Nursing Program of Study. She experiences international recognition as a board-certified family nurse practitioner and expert in advanced forensic nursing care of patients, experiencing an intersection with the legal system. Dr. Speck was also the president of the International Association of Forensic Nurses from 2003 to 2004, chair of the American Public Health Association's Family Violence Prevention Forum and Caucus from 2011 to 2013, and is a current Academy of Forensic Nursing and Forensic Nursing Certification Board member. Our second subject matter expert for today is Miss Diana Fagno. She graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree from the University of North Dakota and her Master's of Science in Nursing from the University of Phoenix. She is the founding board director for End Violence Against Women International, and she is also the current president of the Academy of Forensic Nurses, as well as a retired fellow in the American Academy of Forensic Science and a distinguished fellow in the International Association of Forensic Nurses and a distinguished fellow in the Academy of Forensic Nursing. In April this year, she was the recipient of the 2019 National Crime Victims' Rights Week Award given in Washington, D.C. Just a quick disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without any further ado, I would like to hand the microphone and platform over to our first speaker, Dr. Pat Speck. Dr. Speck?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Your audio sounds great.
Wonderful, and I'd like to welcome everyone, and also welcome Diana Fagno back from the West Coast. I understand she's been on a flight all night long and woke up just to join us, so welcome, Diana. Today we're going to talk about forensic nursing, past and future, growing the forensic nursing specialty.
Dr. Speck, we're not able to see your slides yet.
All right, and let's see what I need to do for that. I need to share the screen, don't I?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you for that. Let me see if I can find a place to share the taskbar. Share screen. Yes, and PowerPoint. And which screen are you seeing?
Right now we're seeing your notes screen.
All right, we'll fix that in just a moment. Display. Can you see the first screen now?
Yes, ma'am. We're on your conflict of interest slide.
All right, so now I'm going to go back to my title slide and scoot over to where my notes will remind me what I need to be saying. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Josh, and Diana and I are looking forward to sharing our shared experiences related to forensic nursing past and what's going to happen in the future. So we have conflicts of interest, if you count federal funding and family business and patent ownership. And again, we're going to repeat the views and opinions also do not represent any of the organizations that we belong to. There also is a disclaimer. The authors make no claims or promises or guarantees about the accuracy or completeness of this content. There's no warranty of any kind implied, expressed. So the references in this presentation to things don't include endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by the authors. They are just facts. And the photographs and arts in this presentation I try to get from Creative Commons or from your tax dollars on government sites. There are copyrights to the authors and their employers, and then written permission is necessary to use any of this material. However, there is a recording by RTI, FTCOE, that's going to be available for distribution if you believe this is important information. So we also, because I'm a UAB faculty, invite students to study at UAB. Any cases mentioned will have a basis in real situations, but they are de-identified and modified to protect persons. I would suspect that Diana and I together have seen close to, I don't know, maybe 75,000 patients over our careers, which span almost 40 years each. So there is a professional responsibility that each of the listeners have, particularly if they're licensed professionals. So we assume no responsibility for your interpretation of this material. And we are healthcare providers licensed, and we aspire to maintain the standards of the practice. There are evidence-based suggestions, and anyone who wants a longer reference than what I've provided, just let me know. So we do have some objectives to discuss the history of the integrated model of forensic nursing, which is the Lynch model. And we're going to analyze the advanced forensic nursing competencies, use a conceptual model of forensic nursing to delineate theories, frameworks, and historical understanding. And more importantly, we're going to outline future opportunities to advance forensic nursing as all our organizations mature. And in particular, we're going to look at the LACE model as a framework for advancing advanced practice forensic nurses. So I put a slide up here to give you some reference. In order to understand ancient history, we have to understand that all women reproductive years were considered wet nurses. It's important to understand the origin of religion with that, and it usually can be traced, the first evidence of religion, in the ancient Near East. And basically they classified religion in three different categories: polytheistic, or multiple gods; pantheistic, where nature is God and God is nature and God is in all things; and then monotheistic, which is one God. And the reason we do that is because to look, Hinduism is multiple gods, but prior to Hinduism was the pantheistic religions, where all of God was in nature and nature was in God. Atheism, believe it or not, is not a religion but a belief, and it only arose about 100 years ago. So if you understand religions, then it helps you understand where we are when we started to get written history and I'm particularly interested in the written history of the nurse. And so, why is it important? Well, let's see. The rise of civilization, obviously, is beyond the scope of this presentation, but only to say that if a society was to survive, there would be wet nurses. And you'll hear that word over and over again. Religions were the foundations for the tribal ancient societies, and they were tribal because there was no level of communications. All of their customs were oral or cryptic, and we see that in the writings on the cave walls and things like that. So today, whenever patients intersect with the law, there'll be a nurse because they dropped the wet out a few hundred years ago. And particularly in ancient history, it informs our understanding of how the nurse role developed. So in the ancient law, you had the Code of Hammurabi, but it's not the oldest one. They were predated by at least two other often cited written laws, and they were from the Middle East, Mesopotamian area, and the Sumerian era. And they are 21 centuries before Common Age. So the Common Era, where we've now have 4,000 to 6,000 years of written history, evidence shows that that code was drawn up nearly 2 centuries before Hammurabi. And these earlier codes, they all share a common bond, and they resemble each other, particularly in the commands and their content. They influenced each other, or perhaps they derived from a similar source. There must have been some level of communication. And there were in these codes laws that protected women, particularly if they were freeborn and not slaves. However, and this is the kicker here, women have always been considered property that produced property, which is their children. So any harm to a woman or a child resulted in restoration of the value determined by the society from the offender. And that restitution went to the male head of family. And so while we consider the punishments really odd today, like stoning and drowning, they served a purpose to keep a structure in society who knew and obeyed those rules. So, okay, here's the history of and please, again, don't kill the messenger here. Women were property. Some of the laws changed as little as 50 years ago in the U.S., but worldwide, women continue to be unable to function as full citizens. For women, ancient history tells us that it was worse. We study it because it informs our understanding about where we are today. And as long as there have been women and babies, there have been wet nurses. So when women branch from breastfeeding role to care for others, maybe others in their family, others in their community, the wet was dropped from the wet nurse and the woman became a nurse. Even if she was performing a male role of a physician, she was still a nurse because of her gender. So let's look at the historical influences. We know that the first nurse in writing was 620 before Common Era, and her name was Rufata bint Sayed. She's Muslim, and her father was a physician, but she nursed his patients with war injuries, poor children. And then there was a general hospital established in Rome about 390 BCE, or the before Common Era. And Saint Fabolia took funds, she was a free woman, took funds from her divorce settlement. Apparently she had an errant husband. And under the laws where women abused could sue for divorce, she received compensation. She predates the biblical, but she's mentioned and she's actually canonized by the Catholic Church. But her deeds were before the establishment of Christianity. And then 100 years before Common Era, Sharaka Samhiti was written in Indian, and she described a state that said a good medical practice requires a patient, a physician, a nurse, and medicines, with the nurse required to be knowledgeable, skilled at preparing formulations and dosages, sympathetic toward everyone, and clean. 55 years BCE, Phoebe was the Christian nurse in the Bible. She was actually a deaconess, which meant that she was over a group of nurses. So the ancient writings about nurses and wet nurses provide a foundation for understanding the role of the feminist theory, social theory, and other theories that we adopt today that say anyone can be a nurse, anybody can care, and as they said in the ancient writing, they can be clean. So the first 500 to 1,000 years ADE, approximately, nursing of infants and children and their mothers was routine, expanded care to palliative needs in their families, and most communities continued to feel the impact of these early codes of conduct from Hammurabi and the earlier folks. So hospitals were rare. Religious organizations took in the sick and poor that didn't have family, where nurses cared for the disadvantaged. So let's go to modern, because at some point between 1,000 before and 1,000 after, Hammurabi's code was felt, but it began to die off in tribal conquests. Laws became customs, and there was a lack of consistency for about 2,000 years. That all ended with the Norman conquest. Prince William fought for the throne he believed he was entitled to, and he gained control over courts. He built castles that are still in existence today throughout the United Kingdom. And in spite of the 100-Year Wars that he did not outlive, judges began to write down their decisions and share it in the kingdoms, the writings provided about other judges. So it provided a common law, and we hear that term now used, common law, and that precedents emerged and judges were removed when they failed to follow previous decisions of their future laws. So overall, while the Normans continue to be disliked by the English who prefer the Saxons, that's what I hear anyway, Normans were great builders, brilliant warriors, and tip-top administrators who changed the world with their language, which was French, and they changed the laws. So Minkowski wrote in 1992, female healers of the Middle Ages had little opportunity to contribute to the science of medicine. Rather, they served as herbalists, midwives, surgeons, barber surgeons, nurses, empirics, and traditional healers. The women of lower or higher birth, as nuns in convents or members of secular orders, these healers were notable for their devotion to the sick under the most stressful circumstances. Untutored in medicine, they used therapies based on botanicals and home remedies, purges, bloodletting, and native intelligence. Their medications were compounded plant materials. There was some superstition and as he wrote, a dash of charlatanism. So that was the basis for the attacks of nurses, where the first recorded attack in 1322 was against Jacqueline Felicie in France. She was a healer who was charged with practicing medicine, and the discrediting of nurses became a campaign promoted by both church and civil authorities, particularly the male physicians. The result was labeling her as a heretic, and the punishment, including stoning and burning, of primarily peasant women occurred. She actually was fined. She was excommunicated, labeled a witch, and they fined her a significant amount of money. The civil and church position in that court case continued into the 15th and 16th century, where prior to the Dark Ages, nurses were revered and promoted to sainthood. Then during the Dark and Middle Ages, female healers had little opportunity to contribute to the science of medicine or attend as a healer. Rather, they served as herbalists, midwives, barber surgeons, nurses, and empirics, and the traditional healer. Regardless of lower or higher birth, as nuns in convents or members of secular orders, these healers were notable for their devotion to the sick under the most stressful circumstances. And during the worst time, as I've seen in the news recently, to be alive on this earth. It was during the many years of the largest plague in the world. It killed 2/3 of the population, called bubonic plague or Black Death. named because they bled under their skin and they turned black before they died. So as I said, women were excluded from nearly all official positions in government. There were no female sheriffs, judges, jurors. They were denied leadership positions in churches and universities. And in the 13th century and Middle Ages, they were generally and consequently family driven. It was central to them. Then the most prominent 13th century philosophers taught that women were mentally inferior and thus naturally subordinate to men. That got codified in common law that persisted up until about 50 years ago in the United States. Nevertheless, recent studies have uncovered women's role in unexpected aspects of this medieval life, from warfare to estate management to civil litigation. In 1275, the first legislation passed to criminalize rape. And for about 100 years, 100% of all rape prosecutions were done by women. And by the way, they had a 65% success rate for the settlement for the victim. However, one record reported 6 out of 35 settled rape cases ended in marriage. Sort of, I guess, a shotgun marriage. The same issues of shame and scorn for victims were present in medieval societies, with the implication for the prototype for forensic nursing, and that is the nurse who responds in court. Well, I couldn't find the female prosecutors. I did find record of a midwife in a record of 1342 testifying in a rape case. Her name was Emmeline La Duchesne, who was a sworn matron of the king, which means she had other nurses in the hospital. And in this case, the courts ordered forensic examination on young maidens. She ended up in court records over the next 25 years, testifying to the veracity of the accusations. Do you think that might have been the modern-day virgin check we experience today? Interestingly, Emmeline and other females were embedded in their communities that were very close-knit. And remember that the judges were beginning to amass a body of law with which to govern that was similar community to community, creating a standardization not heretofore known before the pre-Norman societies. So one of those persons within a couple of hundred years that was practicing nursing was asked by the bishop to become a sister. And when she did, she established the Sisters of Mercy. It began in the Protestant Reformation, and the breakdown of religious orders meant that those monasteries that served all became separated. There were Protestant areas and there were Catholic areas. And then those that were neither were out in the cold. So we're getting really good at recording the history now. And this woman happened to be a Irish woman named Catherine Macaulay. And she actually, her contribution to nursing is that she defined the term careful nursing that was written about by Florence Nightingale in her writings. And of course, any history of nursing would not be complete without Florence Nightingale. She's pivotal for transitioning the role to a profession. But it actually began when she disobeyed her parents. As a child, she took an interest in persons serving her parents and their household, knowing by age 15 she wanted to be a nurse, which, by the way, is a very new, formalized profession. In 1844, she enrolled as a nursing student in a school that was only established in 1836. It was a heavily Catholic community, and she learned about careful nursing, espoused by Catherine Macaulay's Sisters of Mercy. Now, Catherine Macaulay is already dead, but the sisters actually were carrying on her work. And in 1851, she passed that nursing exam at the Kaiserwerth Deaconess Mutter House. Deaconesses at that time helped prisoners and ex-convicts, and they took care of children and assisted the sick and the poor. One of the things that championed nursing was that the pastors at the hospital were Lutheran pastors, and they encouraged help and self-help in nursing care. At the same time, they helped emancipate nurses and women from the physician as a different type of care. They promoted the idea of a sisterhood And again, unmarried women working with the support of a spiritual community, and this is in quotes, but they must be matronly as not to detract from their work. End of quote. The notion spread through the world in a surprising short time, and the same location today is caring for about 14,000 patients every year with a variety of modern day needs. So here's an interesting intertwining of nursing throughout the 1800s, and that is nurses continued to staff asylums and prisons, and Nightingale was responsible for getting poorhouses shut down in the kingdom and provided care to mentally ill. There was a woman, a friend, almost like a daughter to Catherine Macaulay, named Mary Clare Georgiana Moore, who was in England, was a very close friend. And Macaulay's death, Mary Clare founded the Sisters of Mercy in London, and she was a disciple of Catherine Macaulay. She and Nightingale met on their way to the Crimean War, and after worked to achieve military and government reforms by designing and implementing new church-related services to the poor, both in the Lutheran and Catholic faiths. They became very close friends and nursed at the same military hospital, another aspect of forensic nursing. So the picture depicts a hospital in the middle of a military conflict that was fought October 1853 to February 1856. And just in case you forgot the history, this is a war where the Russian Empire lost to the alliance of the Ottoman Empire that had France, Britain, and Sardinia as allies. The immediate cause involved the rights of Christian minorities in the Holy Land, which is part of the Ottoman Muslim Empire. I think they're very important historical parallels today. So let's keep looking as the United States gained independence. Mary Seton founded Sisters of Charity in the U.S., not Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of Charity. And the role of nursing was being formalized in homes, hospitals, and institutions. Clara Barton nursed during the Civil War, each responding to injury. Lillian Wall became the nation's first public health nurse in New York City's Henry Street settlement. Others joined armed services to serve in Spanish-American War and all the wars. Following the wars, whether World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, nurses serve in the military forces. Of interest is that following all wars are depressions, creating vulnerable classes of people unable to find work, pay taxes, as evidenced by the list of depressions in the U.S. In other words, there are always vulnerable populations affected by trauma, whether it's government trauma or social trauma or family trauma. And the understanding about populations that nurse serves is an opportunity to explore the role of the forensic nurse, who by definition serves patients intersecting in legal systems. So one must ask, why is forensic nursing history so important to the forensic nurse? Well, taking from Florence and her teachers, the framework of careful nursing includes core elements of nursing and layers two other distinct sciences, forensic science and legal science, into the history. They remain the same, and as you can see on the list, while not inclusive, we think we have all the components necessary to establish and apply forensic nursing science. So let's read the elements, or some will say constructs. Biopsychosocial spiritual ethics, which includes beneficence, non-maleficence, respect, justice, and autonomy. Then there's humanistic, that includes human dignity, the right to be who you are, and not your disease, which is respect for the uniqueness of the human condition. There's autonomy and patient-centered care, guided by trauma-informed care and evidence-based practice, forensic principles and testimony and legal system. So we'll come back to this, but let's begin to analyze the written history of forensic nursing, the theoretical framework, and those competencies. Virginia Lynch first defined the term forensic nursing. She said it is the application of forensic aspects of healthcare combined with biopsychosocial spiritual education of the registered nurse in the scientific investigation and treatment of trauma and or death of victims and perpetrators of violence, criminal activity, and traumatic accidents. So when Lynch defined forensic nursing, she encompassed nurses who work with vulnerable populations that are intersecting with the legal systems, much like many of the previous nurses noted historically in this presentation. The religious defining nursing also hold that all human life and humanity in all its forms is valued, and consequently it became an ethical value in all specialties in nursing. Let's explore that a little further. There's central concepts identified by Virginia Lynch and identified in her model on this slide. They include culture care, dimensions of law, role clarification, behavior and expectations, interactionism, patient advocacy, problems, social situations, reciprocal social interaction, truth and purposes of truth, presence and perceptivity. Perceptivity is insight and understanding about that person and about the situation, and then regeneration. Julie Valentine is a researcher that analyzed the Lynch thesis in 2014, and what she found gave us an opportunity to launch more research. What she said was, without an applicable theory to guide our practice of research or education, her recommendation was to fill in the blanks. Unfortunately, there are few forensic nurse researchers who are capable of completing the research she espouses. As the discipline matures, however, educators use the Lynch framework to determine domains and performance measures in forensic nursing. This was in the late 1990s, early 2000. It was a time when forensic nurses who were practicing were also educators in academic settings, using the Lynch framework to structure their initial and existing forensic nursing curricula today. Let's explore. In the 1960s, it was a turbulent time. The practice of nursing, the social change at the time, and again, please don't kill the messenger here. History is history. In the 1960s were turbulent. Diane and I were there. We know. And for nurses, too, their understanding about human rights was shifting from the archaic laws identifying women and children as property and women and minorities as inferior to protesting treatment in special interest areas like rape and civil rights. From a 1971 speak out in New York through the grassroots groups, you had Take Back the Night marches and the organizing of rape crisis centers and feminist anti-rape campaigns. They made a difference. They hopped right on top of the back of the civil rights movement and used the same methods. The National Organization for Women created a rape task force in '73 to push for legal reform at the state level. And the American Bar Association promoted legal reform to create gender-neutral statutes. Title IX was one of the first amendments to existing law to promote equal participation by sex in all educational programs, if they were to receive financial aid, and it passed in '72. The body of law increased participation in sports by women significantly and opened scholarships formerly directed only to men. However, there's no mention in Title IX grants of sports programs. Well, eventually the regulations initially promoted as equal opportunity in sports focused attention on ending sexual violence, and that's what we've seen in the last decade. With accurate reporting and services available today, many communities, interestingly, use forensic nursing programs that specialize in sexual assault. Another legislation, Title X, occurred in 1970, and it legislated reproductive health. The challenges to that act led to Roe v. Wade, and it was supported, and it also supported the first nurse practitioner programs in the nation. So many of the nurse practitioners had a ready-made place to practice in the Title X clinics. Another interesting fact is the death penalty for rape, for which Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as an attorney, argued was a remnant of patriarchy and treated women as property. It fell in '77, long before she was a Chief Justice. So another role developed in the '70s was promoted by a physician, Dr. Butt, in Canada. He hired and trained RNs as medical examiner investigators. Now we know it as a forensic nursing role, primarily because he said they had the background knowledge of terminology, pharmacology, because they could work to ease the pain of surviving family members. They were also great spokespersons in the community, and their presence was purported to improve police and medical examiner relationships, which apparently were on the downslide. So, who were the original nurses that began to work in the 70s and 80s to come together in 92? So prior to Lynch, nurses were practicing like nurses in centuries past with the most vulnerable populations, caring for their needs, just with different standards of practice in different organizations. Ann Burgess was a psych mental health nurse. Pat Speck, me, I was in public health primary care clinics. Linda LeDray was a clinical psychologist. Jackie Campbell was an academic researcher looking at domestic violence. Dan Sheridan was working in a women's shelter. And all the California servants promoted by Dr. Laura Slaughter, Diana Fagno was one, all came together. And Virginia Lynch back then was providing care in emergency department and working as a coroner when she decided to go back to school. Her work in an academic setting framed our care, and she named what we're all doing today, forensic nursing. So let's look at some of the history. In the 60s, there was a shortage of physicians, providing an opportunity to create change. Lots of protocols were written so nurses could function with common care of persons. In 65, the first nurse practitioner program was formalized at the University of Colorado. Tennessee Medical Association actually changed the law, expanding the roles of RNs to coronary care units. And Vanderbilt began the first master's program in my state. I'm sure every state has a story like that. They recruited a woman named Beverly Bounds from Colorado, a nurse practitioner, where she helped set up nurse practitioner roles in Tennessee. And I wouldn't let this piece of history go because it was so important for me in my development. And that had been that Dr. Bounds was the person who conceptualized a program in a public health center that would morph into one of the leading programs responding to sexual violence in the 90s and 2000s. Dr. Bounds was recruited specifically by the University of Tennessee to come and to implement the nurse practitioner programs. I can only surmise that when she read Ann Burgess's landmark study, that by the way was an international sensation, that she thought the role was ideal for the nurse practitioner. And already functioning in Title X clinics, these are family they already had the skills. She got the support of the ED physicians who were very unhappy having to do rape analysis. And it relieved the residents who were often put there as punishment. And the judges were the ones that said, yes, nurses could testify about what they did. So the federal grant was awarded through Health and Human Services in 73, and after training, these nurses saw patients that reported to Title X clinics, including children. So it would be over 10 years before the child abuse laws changed nationwide and almost 20 years before the role was named. So we're going from the 70s to the 90s when Virginia entered our lives. Like other early forensic nurses, the initial training was see one, do one, teach one. And with forensic laboratory and the prosecutors, that was because we already knew how to nurse. We already knew how to collect and package samples. We already knew how to send them to the lab so that they wouldn't be mixed up. Only now, we had to do it through the police department and to a forensic laboratory. So if you want to know about the early kits, listen to the FTCOE podcast, Just Science, about the evolution of sexual assault evidence. I would be remiss not to mention the physicians who were also doing this work in emergency departments all over the country. But soon, as Diana told me this morning, nurses were emerging as the experts in forensic care of sexual crimes. In Memphis, that role was a nurse practitioner. They saw everyone across the lifespan, whether it was sexual or physical. So Dr. LaDre's saying, flying by the seat of our pants in the 80s was an apt description of our role. It took an advanced practice nurse to forge the role in clinics and emergency departments. It took physicians using RNs in emergency departments in Texas and Missouri to get to the point that the community response was established. And when we finally got together, the roles were strikingly the same, except in states where nurse practitioners were writing the prescriptions and following the patients through their regular clinics. Diana tells me that Dr. Laura Slaughter was instrumental in the establishment of the response to rape, and Sherry Arndt was the first nurse in Santa Cruz. This role quickly spread to other communities as California was a tight-knit group, eventually influencing all responses to rape nationally. Most nurses practicing at the time were communicating through journal publications or books. Dr. LaDre is credited with assembling the bulk of nurses specializing in sexual assault care in 1992 at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. The first speakers were Dr. Margaret Aiken and Linda LaDre and Virginia Lynch and Sue Perdue and me. Sue spoke about pediatric populations needs and the formation of a new organization called APSAC, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and she encouraged members to join. Maggie and I spoke about the scope and standards of our nursing practice in Memphis, and we felt it was necessary to guide the practices, and we presented the analysis completed at our agency, identifying this new role in sexual assault care that also included child abuse, elder abuse, rape, and generally covering the lifespan and all types of crimes. However, we submitted an application to the American Nurses Association to be a specialty, and ANA returned our application and told us to form an organization. And then Virginia Lynch spoke about her thesis framing the term forensic nursing. The discussions were about specializing in sexual violence or the greater role of forensic nursing. I argued by writing on a blackboard, yes, it was a different time then, that the broader term would allow for a practice like mine to fit up under the entire umbrella, and that sexual assault would be one of those subspecialties. As an early adopter of forensic nursing, there were a variety of specialties that were dripping from this overarching frame that we hadn't even considered. So Diana tells me, and she can tell you herself, but she tells me her first thoughts about me in my lecture was to throw rotten tomatoes at me because she didn't want to go back to school. But I get the last smile about this. She eventually went back to school and is informed differently today. So what did Virginia Lynch say? And keep in mind the constructs, propositions, and frame for the practice. This is what Virginia wrote. A forensic nurse is a nurse who provides specialized care for patients who are victims and perpetrators of trauma, both intentional and unintentional. She also wrote that forensic nurses have specialized knowledge of the legal system and skills in injury identification, evaluation, and documentation. After attending to a patient's immediate medical needs, a forensic nurse often collects evidence, provides medical testimony in court, and consults with legal authorities. Do you see the areas that tie together forensic nursing as a unique specialty? Nursing, forensic science, and legal science. So let's talk about the organization that started out with about 100 members, the International Association of Forensic Nursing, primarily nurses working with patients experiencing sexual assault, but quickly grew. The early officers in IAFN resurrected the application that we submitted to ANA, and now we had an organization to submit it, and it paid off. ANA recognized forensic nursing as a specialty in 1995. The scope and standards for sexual assault was used for the 97 collaboration with ANA in the publication. And all of the previous scopes and standards are in the current publication in the appendices. So in 99, many academicians wanted to structure their curriculum offerings, not continuing education, And the educators met at a number of universities, I think 3 or 4, University of Pennsylvania, um, uh, and those are the ones that I remember, but maybe Boston. But they wanted to determine the domains and performance measures that were necessary for forensic nursing curriculum. In the same year, a publication defined forensic nursing practices as where nursing and legal intersect, and that was authored by me and Peters. The educators provided a structure for that first graduate programs, and by then the organization quickly represented a variety of nursing roles. They included psych mental health, coroners, death investigators, domestic violence, elder abuse, and child abuse, with more to come. IFN was able to maintain the diversity in the roles a little less than 20 years. So there was a need for forensic nurse program analysis and sustainability, and grants were written to establish graduate programs in elder abuse and technical assistance for programs that were unable to sustain their forensic nursing response to sexual assault victims. There was a need for technical assistance, and so in systems management, there was a SANE operations and guideline publication supported by the Department of Justice. And the emergence of evidence to support this forensic nursing practice in criminal justice systems focused on the SANE role impact. Grants were awarded to find out if there were better criminal justice outcomes, not nursing outcomes, and if efficient charging was a collaborative and team effort. Again, it's not nursing, but it highlighted the issues identified by Dr. Valentine in her analysis, and you can get that online. Nursing research goes through phases, and I've lectured about this at different meetings, but it usually starts with describing what we're doing, not the impact on our patients. And during the early years, some graduate and doctoral prepared nurses were beginning to occupy places at the table where they could influence the funding and practices, like technical working groups, and they were working in groups to assemble best practices and things like that. All of that is necessary for the forensic nurse seeking approval for their expertise, and the forensic nurse academician needed promotion to meet tenure track goals. So all of this was coming together that was outside the actual practice of forensic nursing, but it was influencing the practice. So the graduate academic programs were very successful in putting nurses in strategic positions during those times, and in particular, the Academy of Nursing, through the expert panels of violence and global, were able to influence legislation and practice. The degree programs were particularly expansive and covered not only practice, but meeting nurse essentials for education. And that's the buzzword for the academicians, that somebody else higher than us is setting up what we need to be doing. And they met all the systems levels analysis for graduate programs. And they covered areas like criminology, victimology, justice processes, and where there were intersections with health and practice in this nursing care. So here's some of the early schools that offer master's and doctorate in nursing science, or DNPs. Today there are a number of programs with PhD programs teaching research, DNP programs teaching practice integration and quality improvement. Some are at criminal justice, liberal arts schools. Others stand alone as a program of study, like state schools like Texas A&M and University of Alabama at Birmingham. There are a number of postgraduate certificates around, focused program of study of interest to forensic nurses. And the graduate PhD programs where advanced practice nurses are serving now on committees as members and as chairs, helping direct focus research about forensic nursing practice. So if you're considering returning to school for forensic nursing, be a really good consumer and find faculty that support your area and expertise and your interest. Go on and take the plunge. So let's not forget about continuing education, because it's important for the RN practicing. It was emerging in the 80s and 90s as a rapid way to improve practice skills for the forensic nurse, particularly in sexual assault care. It was easy, no testing. There was an improvement in understanding about the needs of this particularly special and vulnerable population, and it was a great way to improve skills and become an expert in your community. Providing practice components proved a little difficult, and it remains difficult today. Some of those programs offered certificates of attendance for building practice skills and used satisfaction surveys to justify their offerings. Listeners to this presentation need to understand that the academic environment is different. If they're good consumers, here's the lay of the land for the academic standards. It's accredited educational curriculum in forensic nursing. It's awarded as a degree. You actually have the courses listed in your transcript. You can get a diploma, a graduate certificate, or any number of other things. Once earned, they can't take it away from you. Graduate students learn the foundations of forensic nursing science, learn the language of the discipline, and the curriculum is typically content-based. But as the content becomes so vast, educators realized that it was important to not teach facts, but to teach students how to get the best evidence for their practices. Hence, many schools teach concepts today in coursework, like the concept of criminology or victimology, or psychology, psychiatry, or biology, physiology, and then relate it back to trauma. These are actually nursing concepts that are easily translated into the review of the material for graduate students. And there is an opportunity with SimLabs for demonstration of competence, which is not competency. Competency, on the other hand, is the judgment of the employer. And that's why partnerships between universities and hospitals work. Hospitals seeking magnet status look to universities to provide competent, educated employees who demonstrate competency. And knowing the difference between the master's, DNP, and PhD helps the future student choose the right path for them. So I talked about having thought-provoking analysis of the theoretical framework. To provide that, history informs our thinking about this situation. So we got to know where we began. We barely got rid of the term wet in wet nurse, but in the 1980s, there were fewer than 20 articles about patients intersecting with legal systems. Descriptions primarily about the rigor of our practice. One of the first articles was by Moynihan in the 60s, responding to trauma. They were used in a consensus model to promote best practices, but in reality, some of the early thinking was easily dismissed. For instance, RNs couldn't use colposcopes because the physicians argued it was a tool that was diagnosis. I visited and spoke to most boards of nursing that had forensic programs in the early 80s and 90s about the tool was not diagnostic, but rather it was a magnifying glass. And they're not diagnosing cervical disease, but they're using it to inspect for injury. And if they're going to take away magnification, they might as well take away any glasses that they wear. Obviously, colposcopes became the standard of care in the 80s and 90s, eventually falling out of favor because of cost and training. And the SLR camera, with all its bells and whistles, is now the standard. I understand some are using phones, so I expect this to be a fluid area too. And that's what happens as marketers pay attention to the forensic nursing practices. Even the speculum is changing. So in addition, there was emerging research filtering through nursing curriculum that addressed stress and adverse childhood experiences. But in the 90s, forensic nurses were still describing what they were doing, even arguing about what was best practice. And there's reason for that. There wasn't any research to support any of the elements of our practices except in the nursing literature. But the 2000s changed that, and now there are hundreds of programs. And we began to see case studies and case controls. Ann Burgess was collecting data on child abuse and elder abuse. Boykins looked at follow-up in a population of rape victims. Linda Rossman and her Michigan team began to publish about their data. And Marilyn Summers compared population with different injuries, highlighting disparity in detection of injury with minorities. These studies and many others provided a window for forensic nurses to begin to integrate their findings, even though they were not generalizable. When duplicated, the findings informed providers, and they masked a group of studies for comparison. The 2010s saw bigger data and prospective studies that actually changed the practice of forensic nursing, specifically in collection techniques and timing for DNA sampling. This research is necessary to support the policies and procedures and programs. However, the early adopters will see resistance in those who are entrenched in beliefs about change. And let's acknowledge it, change is hard. So in the current decade, there's now basic physiology research occurring in multiple sites, informed by practicing forensic nurses. Some are prospective and they're emerging as practice pearls for the practicing nurse, answering very specific questions like what are cortisol levels after trauma. There's another about staining processes and use of toluidine blue versus fluorescence dye. And then there's DNA detection that I'm embroiled in. So we're seeing the integration of ACEs and routine nursing research now as a possible reason for population differences in health. And others are looking at the physiology of trauma, like cognition following trauma and HIV and domestic violence. All of that's currently under study. These studies will have significant implication for understanding the relationship between trauma and health that informs the forensic nurse. So concepts about trauma-informed care, the application of the model is ongoing, and our own Annie Lewis O'Connor is a leader in the clinical application of TIC. It's in the awareness of the impact of stress that's beginning to emerge, and it's about a life's trajectory and an experience that may begin before conception and continue throughout a person's life. One important emerging study design is separating those who have little adversity from those with lots of adversity. The ACE studies taught us that our health is affected by our choices, but our choices may be a normal response to a very abnormal event with significant impact on our health. How do we as forensic nurses identify those most vulnerable? And what do we need to do to mitigate the biological response to promote their health? Well, I believe the answer is exploring the origins and impact of the forensic nursing specialty, because the more we research and understand, the less we know. So we look back to the Lynch framework. Lynch's framework, as analyzed by Julie Valentine, identified concepts that are not yet analyzed or actualized. Things like culture care, dimensions of law, role clarification, behavior expectations, and others. Each of these words represents a belief in nursing, beginning with nurse relationship, the biopsychosocial spiritual aspects of our patients, and our relationship with our patient is one specific role as a forensic nurse. Most of these items have analysis in the nursing role with different types of patients, like cancer patients. However, there's a dearth of forensic nursing body politic related to research. Also absent is the elephant in our research projects, forensic science and legal science. Is it possible that Lynch's framework for forensic nursing science is correct after all? Before the Valentine article published, educators were invited to test this hypothesis. UAB School of Nursing hosted forensic nursing educators in 2014, and these brilliant keepers of forensic nursing education nationally spent 2 days addressing all concepts in nursing, forensic science, and legal science. Those are the basic tenets of the Lynch model, using a modified Delphi method, which means they came to consensus. They confirmed that there are 3 domains: nursing science, that includes nursing and public health, forensic science, and legal science. Let's look a little closer. Like I said, they modified a method, tested the conceptualization of forensic nursing with a lens of, for some, like me, up to 30 years of practice experience. The brilliant keepers of this education spent those 2 days, and this is what they found. They were borrowing science from other disciplines. Well, that happens all the time. They looked at the propositions to include systems cares, specifically to meet the essentials in the documents purported by the American Association of Colleges of Nursing. The second domain was forensic science, including understanding all the science of forensic science and the educational programs used in forensic science laboratories to improve the experience of their students. And then, of course, legal propositions like government laws, testimony, and those constructs to encourage students to apply knowledge through intersection with courts and attorneys. The evolution of the forensic nursing is best described in the scope and standards of practice, and I won't read all of this, but it defines the forensic nursing practice as grounded in rich biopsychosocial spiritual education, and that it targets identification, management, and prevention of intentional and unintentional injuries in global community. It also interprets these clinical presentations of intentional and unintentional and documenting what they're seeing, understanding the difference between evidence and injury, interpreting those influencing factors, and then documenting that so the legal system will absolutely find what they have to say useful to their processes. It also addresses the privacy, respect, and dignity that is afforded by the forensic nurse to that person that they're treating. So if you can see, while it's diffuse, the elements of forensic nursing practice, again, include nursing, forensic, and legal sciences. So prior to the last permutation of the scope and standards of practice, the educators identified these primary concepts and precepts about the practice, and they're strikingly the same. They follow wounding, healing, ethics, evidence, and legal propositions, and the Lynch model that were first identified in the 1992 meeting. There are many more, but this list represents the educators thinking about the content and concepts under each of these domains. They include wounding, healing, with biopsychosocial spiritual elements, ethics, evidence, and legal. The educators were fascinated by the opportunity to re-examine these concepts, constructs, and propositions. Each brought their pedagogical views, and the items they highlighted, the basics that is necessary for a well-rounded forensic nurse professional at the BSN level, is supported by the scope and standards, and also at the graduate and doctoral levels. For some, the educational program prepared practitioners. For others, prepared researchers. Others provide the bedside nurse. It's a tremendous discussion about the content in their courses, the concepts, constructs, propositions, but these are just a few that fit on the slide under the scientific domains of nursing, forensic, and legal science. I think when we came away from that meeting, all agreed that it's necessary for all areas of nursing practice, particularly forensic nursing practice. They also agreed that there may be gaps, and those gaps were eventually identified by Dr. Valentine, and the frame is adequate to begin the next decade in the 2020s with robust research addressing gaps in practice areas. So, another activity of note for forensic nursing practice is the influence on policy. Many early forensic nurses now work with the Academy of Nursing to promote policy from the violence and expert panels. We influence the care of the vulnerable, and of interest to forensic nurse is patient advocacy, influencing nursing, forensic, legal systems, policies, and politic dialogues or conversation that influence thinking. And these policy briefs all have one thing in common, that they impact patients who are intersecting with legal systems, who experience trauma in all its forms, in all its various stages of healing, intersecting with nursing, the nursing science, the ethics, the forensic and legal science. They're available for all. So one example is the human trafficking policy brief that resulted in Title X rule and regulation changes. And if you want to know more about that, please email me. The authors that helped with that, me, Rochelle Croze, Rosario Sanchez, and Stacy Mitchell, also supported by senior author Deanne Messias. These women are change agents for sure. They actually got in the regulation that with the human trafficking policy brief that Title X clinics must now address child abuse and human trafficking. So, boots on the ground also have had a significant impact. Language is changing to reflect the newest understanding about forensic nursing, all borrowed from other sciences with heavy influence from the community advocate. Most is good, like changing the language from refuse to decline. Another change is that patient-centered movement became a victim-centered movement. Many nurses are now influenced by advocacy and adopt unfounded propositions because they don't know how to find or interpret the nursing evidence. The adoption of actions from advocacy may be in conflict with existing research on recovery following trauma. For instance, many espouse saying it's not your fault. Well, research supports personal discovery through reflection and cognitive behavioral therapy. And for some persons, the process is intrinsic, but for others, they need time to cognitively work through their actions that created vulnerability in the first place so they can emphatically say that for themselves, it's not my fault. Research supports reflection, cognitive behavioral therapy, and social support in order to experience adversarial growth. This is a term for persons who move from survivor, which is a common term used among advocates and forensic nurses alike, to thriver. Most people overcome trauma, and when a person reaches the point of thriving, they put the experience in one of the many boxes of experiences in their lives, and they take it out only when triggered. Overcoming trauma is learning how to address the triggers in a healthy way. But when multiple adverse childhood experiences occur, the addition of significant trauma requires professional help, not lay counseling, and certainly not forensic nurse providing her opinion that it's not your fault. So when we delve into the literature, we find that nurses do and say what makes them feel good, not necessarily what's in the best interest of the patient. So if we remember the patient responds normally to abnormal trauma, and there is no experience in the recovery of some traumas, what we do initially is going to be branded in their five senses. That's why the patient can recall touch, vision, smell, sounds, taste. If the forensic nurse understands that anxiety is a normal reaction to trauma, they can begin the process of overcoming anxiety, mitigate it, and expect it to return and learn techniques to abort it through their practices. And increasingly, with practice, they begin to overcome moving from survivor to thriver. Only scholarship of practice in forensic nursing patients will benefit the patient. And we have to move toward applying known scholarship and not a feel-good statement. So one way to help nurses understand the nursing model is to teach forensic nursing through a conceptualization of patients who intersect with legal system. And many nursing schools and colleges have implemented Gene Giddens' concepts for forensic nursing practice as a pedagogy. And they're teaching it through conceptualization of real patients with real life experiences. The benefit is most nurses have foundational knowledge of a person-nurse environment, and they've taken care of persons experiencing the social determinants of health. Therefore, teaching these concepts, constructs, and propositions in forensic nursing is transitioning many nurse practices, particularly at the graduate level. For instance, implementation of a concept model in forensic nursing would use published materials to inform content and deliverables. Using the Lynch domains, coursework's built around exemplars in nursing science and practice at the level of a license. But it also includes forensic science exemplars and exemplars in legal environments that are based on legal tenets and their sciences. For example, injury is a concept. And the exemplar is psychological impact of injury, physical impact of injury, social impact of injury, all of it made more complex when injury is intentional, involving forensic science, where the concept is evidence, but the exemplar is physical, verbal, or digital evidence in the context of the human experience. And the concept of law or legislation or testimony, the exemplars might be Constitution, Bill of Rights, rules of evidence, testimony testimony about a particular case. So foundation to all concepts and exemplars is a common knowledge about biology, psychology, sociology, spirituality, and regardless of the nursing or forensic or legal science. This information is so vast, it cannot be boiled down to content, but must follow the guidelines promoted by those responsible for higher education. Testing on all the propositions in the Lynch theoretical framework is impossible until we gather the science to support the deconstructed elements of our practices today and identify those gaps. So where do we find the scientists to support our practices? It's in the existing nursing science, whether culture, genomics, cardiac response. The list is extensive. And this is what's happening this decade. Nursing techs have integrated forensic patients into their techs. You see it in pediatrics, you see it in primary care nurse practitioners, you see it child abuse, family violence, elder abuse, and geriatric coursework. The signs and symptoms are now part of the history taking. Title 10 rules and regulations make you ask about child abuse. Use evidence-based screening tools for intimate partner violence and trafficking, and report it under your state laws if you find it, particularly in child abuse and child trafficking. So the first step is in understanding the intentional acts that are criminal. In pediatrics, nurse practitioners are learning how to consider child abuse as a differential diagnosis. They're being taught how to examine children. And these are just a few. Acute care nurse practitioners are being taught how to preserve evidence in the emergency department, as well as legal ramification of collection, transfer, and patient privacy. And these things are happening with and without forensic nursing experts. So what does the future look like? There's diverse forensic nursing roles that cover a variety of patients seen in clinical practices, where every nurse has an element of forensic nursing in their practice. And while forensic nurses began strong in psych mental health and corrections, you need only look at the numbers there. Sexual assault nurses had a good start. Legal nurse consultants have a totally different body of literature. Geriatric specialists in adult gero abuse and assault and financial abuse, they have a different body of literature. Nurse attorneys, forensic clinical specialists, and others are evolving. And nurses are joining organizations all over the place and writing about their experiences in the populations they serve. Let's take a look at the number of articles and search terms for rape, sexual assault, SANE, and other forensic mental health. Clearly, forensic nurse leaders are contributing to the body of forensic nursing practice and science. In 1993 to 17, with the search term forensic mental health, there were over 250,000 publications. And they're doing it in different organizations. Each of these organizations listed meet a unique need for the practicing forensic nurse. Some are research focused, others are focused on policy, others represent geographic locations. Still others are interprofessional or multidisciplinary or both, and still others are focused on one type of forensic nursing, like SANE. The smorgasbord is broad, and there is a home for the forensic nurse wishing to participate in the growth of the discipline. One such organization I'll promote today is the Academy of Forensic Nursing. Established last year in 2018, it's the newest organization to meet the needs of the diverse forensic nurse practice, education, and scholarship. Their organizational goals are to serve all forensic nurses while not displacing the good works of other forensic nursing organizations. Let's talk about one of their organizational goals, specifically reaching consensus under the LACE model. So for over 25 years, professional nurses, advanced practice, and advanced nurses have had no organization to meet their needs. So with the expansion of their forensic nursing practices into their clinics and emergency departments, they want to promote forensic nursing as a specialty in their area, and especially with the vulnerable populations, whether they be located rural, in emergency rooms, or in clinics. The Academy plans to reach consensus, and consensus is a formal term, by meeting the LACE model and appealing to the consensus body nationally. So what does that mean, LACE? L stands for licensure, and forensic nursing is familiar to boards of nursing, and some have regulated their practices. We see regulation for advanced practice nurses, much like acute care nurse practitioners. A stands for accreditation, and in this case, it's the accreditation of the schools or colleges of nursing in educational institutions, whether they're private or public. And C stands for certification. That's a little tricky here. There are specific mandates from certification bodies. However, the Academy, through the Forensic Nurse Certification Board, plans to offer generalist forensic nursing certification within 2 years or sooner. And then last, there is E, which stands for education. Graduate education exists and curriculum exists in schools of nursing, and it's specific to forensic nursing programs. They may be in master's or doctorate. They may take it as an intensive or elective, but they exist for the nurse wishing to excel at the master's and doctoral level of nursing. The theoretical framework for these forensic nursing practices exists in the template for implementation of forensic nursing programs in schools and colleges worldwide. Once LACE is met, it will be determined that they meet consensus, and forensic nurses through the academy will petition for consensus. So this does not work, I don't think. Let's see if it's going to pull up. And this is a better explanation. Let me see if I can't get it going here.
In 2004, nurse leaders representing 23 organizations began working together over a 4-year period to develop new national standards for advanced practice registered nurses. These standards, when adopted by each state, will ensure that the education, accreditation, certification, licensure, and practice requirements for advanced practice registered nurses are the same throughout the country. This will increase mobility of advanced practice registered nurses and allow them to move to other states without having to meet different licensure requirements. And most significant, the new changes outlined in the consensus model ensure public safety by making.
So that is a little bit of what consensus means. This is a YouTube that you can go look up just by putting consensus and LACE in your search terms. So there is room for you at the table. It is not likely that the RN at the bedside will be replaced, but there is movement toward others outside registered nursing wanting to serve, and they include nurse helpers, licensed vocational nurses, medics, and a number of other things. Without the foundation of nursing science and practice, what will happen to that? Together, RNs, APRNs, and doctorate-prepared nurses will participate fully in the scopes and standards of the practice of forensic nursing. And like every other nurse, we have to protect the health and wellness of our patients. So that is a state mandate under our license. So Diana and I have some personal thoughts we want to leave you with. We're both born into this world with personal and unique circumstance, with genetic predisposition and intergenerational epigenetic influence of traumas unknown to us. Everyone and everything influences who you are becoming, where mistakes and missteps are an expectation. You must experience in order to have perspective, even if vicariously. And curiosity is a good skill to develop, especially if you have time to reflect and ponder. Be careful of what you want. You're liable to get it. The future of forensic nursing is safe. And I think that's what we want the listeners to know. There's structural changes in education and practice. There's conceptualization and analysis of the role. It's going to persist for future generations. There's a future talent who will rise to do the work to address the needs of the role in a variety of settings. There's lots of organizations with which to align with, particularly if you align with their visions and missions. Last, the original framework promoted by Lynch has stood the test of time, going on almost 3 decades. Where gaps continue to be identified and the role continues to develop, but it's grounded in nursing science. And where nurses continue to borrow from the forensic and legal sciences and other sciences, Diana and I want you to know we wish you all the best as you travel your life's journey. And remember that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. Thank you very much, and I will take questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Speck. I'm going to go ahead and take control back over of the screen. All right, so we did have a question that came in. So I'll pose this one to you, Dr. Speck, but Diana, feel free to jump in. So the question is, I'm a nurse at the bedside and not an NP, so how does LACE apply to me at the bedside? I don't have any plans to go back to school.
That's a great question. It has no effect on you at all. You still will be able to practice at the bedside, and you will still have continuing education to promote the development of your skill. This is where choosing your organization is going to be very important. You need to align with an organization that improves the skill that you want to be excellent in. I will tell you that the RN at the bedside is a critical element in the recovery of patients who find themselves in situations where they're intersecting with the legal system and they have need of specialized care. And the forensic nurse at the bedside is that person. But what we found out is that there are not enough of you. Diana, you're a nurse at the bedside.
Yes, thank you, Pat. I think probably one of my pearls that I would like to leave is that there is just a shortage of forensic nurses. There is such a growing demand for the forensic nurse at the bedside due to the expanding role, whether you're doing strangulation exams, whether you're seeing children in an acute care facility or at a child advocacy center. There's just a growing need for this. And there's so much work to do. I think my best example of this probably was with a group of nurses in Lancaster, California, who have, it's a small hospital, but they have the second busiest emergency room in California. So what they did, what their administration allowed, was to add a forensic nurse 24/7 in that emergency room. So we have a nurse there now who's able to identify forensic cases. Not that they come in like that, excuse me, but they're being identified. And it's just absolutely wonderful to see the growth around this. So that's my message that I would like to leave. We need more forensic nurses. So that's it, Pat.
Well, and I will add to that. Let's just fast forward, and that one forensic nurse gets overwhelmed by the volume of patients he's seeing. The hospital will then determine we might need two. And then pretty soon the hospital might be big enough to where you need 20 or 30. And in the larger systems, they are beginning to form forensic nursing teams that are responding to all types of forensic patients. This is an opportunity for input at the policy level because you want JCAHO and other accrediting bodies to recognize forensic nursing as a necessity, since 35% of patients presenting in the emergency room have intersections with the legal system. But then the other piece of that is how do you encourage nurses to see forensic nursing as an option to improve the skills that the nurse that asked the question already has? So how do you use her as a conduit to bring others to the table? Because it's not just about sexual assault. It's about child abuse, domestic violence, family violence, you name it, strangulation, different kinds of injuries, gunshot wounds. That is the forensic nurse of the future.
Any other questions, Josh?
So while we are waiting on other questions to come in, I did have a question. Dr. Speck, you went through the history of nursing as well as forensic nursing, and has obviously expanded exponentially over time. Where do you see forensic nursing as far as the roles and responsibilities going, not only in the short term, the next few years, but also over time in the next 10 years? How much more do you feel like forensic nursing will come into play in the medical field?
I actually see it doing the same thing that culture did. It came in as a specialty. We had experts running around telling us how to integrate culture into our practices. I think that there will be the experts, forensic nurses that do this all the time that we'll look to as leaders, but they will cover the gamut. They will be nurse practitioners, they'll be PhDs, they'll be bedside nurses, and they all have something valuable to add to that element. So it will reflect what's going on in nursing anyway, which is the integration of concepts. And the concepts of forensic nursing are in all of our practices.
And Pat, I would also add that there needs to be a deeper dive into the schools of nursing, the basic nursing courses, where this is addressed, maybe with each system.
Again, you're absolutely right, Diana. The bachelor prepared nurse will, in their textbooks now, have what's necessary to be introduced to the foundations of violence and its impact. And in the global scheme, the CDC calls it injury and injury prevention. And so nurses cover the gamut of development. They also cover the gamut of primary, secondary, and tertiary responses to mitigate the long-term health outcomes in forensic nursing, from trauma. When we look at, for instance, the global opioid epidemic, we know that a significant number of persons who are addicted have trauma backgrounds. So the psych mental health nurse is necessary, the emergency room nurse is necessary, critical care is necessary, and clinic nurses are necessary in order to help that person reach a higher level of wellness when they leave their presence.
Pat, it looks like we've got another question. Josh, will you give that one to Pat?
Yeah, so Dr. Speck, Elizabeth is asking, I'm currently pursuing my BSN, but passionately want to pursue my SANE certs. I'm also taking extensive administrative justice classes through community college under the forensic science investigation. Do you feel like this is advisable? She wants to make sure that she takes these classes to form a good foundation for laws, procedures, evidence collection, testifying, etc.
That's a great question. I will tell you that you will have a great foundation for exactly what you want. I will also tell you that nursing will not accept it. So nursing is limited by the national bodies that want nurses to be in nursing schools. But there are many nurses that seek degrees and are very successful in their forensic nursing practice. And one of the persons I want to tell you about is Kathy Bell in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who actually could advise you, Elizabeth, about that, about how it informed her practices, and then what would she have done differently, or what would she have kept or thrown away. I mean, all of those kinds of questions are great questions. And she's on the board of the academy, and you can reach her through that website. So yeah, it's a great question. As someone who reviews transcripts, courses outside of nursing do not and cannot count toward nursing degrees.
All right, we do have another question that came in. What recommendations can you offer to meet the challenges of integrating the local community members of SART, such as electronic discovery not crossing boundaries?
Well, this is Diana, and thank you for that question. That's always a touchy subject. because everyone within your SARC community, whether it's law enforcement, advocacy, child protective services, or DHS, they all have certain roles that they play. And so they're kind of working, what we don't want them to do is work in a silo. So anytime that you can discuss things such as electronic discovery, who has access to those records, HIPAA, confidentiality, and get that out on the table and talk with your members, things will go much better later on. Your hospital probably has some pretty strict policy about releasing records, who has access to those records, as well as the patient giving that access. So if you don't have those procedures, policies in place, you will need them in order to move forward. And I hope that was the content of the question.
All right, we did have one more question that came in. This one's for you, Dr. Speck. Do you ever see the ANCC bringing back the AFN certification?
At this point, my last conversation with Dr. Hatmaker, who was over the certification, ANCC certification process for a lot of years, who's now president of ANA, she said that the financial decisions to discontinue the portfolio certifications would die out with the last person certified. One of the gaps in forensic nursing professional development is certification. There exists today a forensic nurse certification board that's working diligently to execute a forensic nursing certification for the non-graduate prepared and graduate prepared forensic nurse. The text for studying for that certification, and it will be a test, will be available hopefully by the end of the year. And then the first certifications offered in 2020. I think what's happening is that we have the capacity to structure our own professional body politic, regardless of where the organizations are. It behooves us to come together to create strategies so that all forensic nurses benefit. So join our team at the Academy of Forensic Nursing, and we are working diligently on this. We need all on board.
All right, we're going to go with one last question before we wrap up today. What can we do to change the public view and the view of the greater healthcare community that the forensic nurse is not just a saying?
Well,
Diana, we'll both take this one.
Yeah, that is going to come with time. And I would just offer an example is that you see, at least I do, many more nurses using the terms, I am a forensic nurse. So for those programs where you have job descriptions, if you're working in a hospital or an advocacy center, look at the title of your job description and the duties. That would be the first place to start to try to get that changed. Change your name badge. And then I guess that's all I'm going to say on that, Pat. Go ahead, Pat.
Those are excellent things to do in your organization. Another thing that I'm doing at the academic level is everything is forensic nursing in sexual assault care, in domestic violence care, in corrections care. And because forensic nurse is what the designation was given as a specialty by ANA. They didn't specify SANE. They didn't specify domestic violence, but they did specify forensic nurse. So to take it to your institution is to take with you that designation of specialty forensic nursing, and then describe the different roles. This also gives you the opportunity to expand your practice beyond sane. And so it's a way to build a foundation. Another thing I'll advise you about is to look to the Sane Development Operations Guide and take sexual assault out of it. There's tremendously good information about how to change organizations and change how they articulate in the community, just in that body of knowledge. It applies, even though it was written for SANE, it applies for all areas of forensic nursing practice.
Thank you so much, Dr. Speck, and thank you, Diana, for your presentation and also all the hard work that you've put in for the forensic nursing and the nursing community in general. Thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thanks, everybody.
Right,
Thank
and
you.
with that, we are going to go ahead and close out for today. You will see in the chat pod, I have put the presentation outline that Dr. Speck has provided for all of the audience. So make sure that you do click on that and download the outline for today. You can also find it back on the main webinar page if you would like to refer back to that at a later date. But it is a great resource that she has put together, so make sure that you do download that. We did record today's presentation, so we will be turning that around into our archival in the next few weeks, and we will send out an email to everyone that attended for that as well. You will see that Julian is posting in our chat pod links to our social media outlets, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Please make sure you are following us on all of those outlets to stay up to date on all of our offerings. Also, check out our podcast and our website that will have everything that we offer from the FTCOE. We definitely want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. Without your support, these webinars would simply not be possible. Below the live feed and the closed caption, you will see there is a link on the bottom right to our presentation outline. And then also, once you go to the presentation outline, you will find the survey. If you could take a few moments to complete our survey, that'll give us some great feedback about today's presentation, as well as the new platform. We would love to have your feedback, so if you could take a few moments to do that, we would greatly appreciate it. Again, thank you to our presenters today. Thank you for everyone that joined us for today's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Recording has stopped.